Hi, good night, and welcome to the program, The Open Book. The Open Book is your weekly Bible study podcast where you get the Word of God unfiltered. The Open Book is not about creeds, it's not about church doctrine, but the Open Book is about truth. And tonight we continue our study in the book of Genesis as we continue looking at the final character or main character in the Genesis story. Uh, Before I recap, just a reminder that one has to think of the book of Genesis as a narrative. And in a narrative, you'll find that you have main characters. So the book of Genesis is as aspects of what one would find generally in a literature book. And so you find, firstly, as it relates to human, the main character was Adam. And at the death of Adam, you find the genealogy. That's in Genesis 5. So in Genesis 5, there's a genealogy of Adam, of the antediluvian race. The whenever you see scripture does that, it means, especially in Genesis, there's a pattern. You will find that the next chapter will introduce, or even prior to the next chapter, there will be the introduction of the next uh, character, the next main character. And so it was in Genesis 5 and 6, we are introduced to Noah. By the time we reach Genesis 10, you find that you again get another genealogy. And we are then introduced to Abraham, Genesis 12. By the time we get to about Genesis 24, 25, you find again the closing off of Abraham's life, and you find the genealogy. Then, with that genealogy, the next main character is Isaac. Isaac and Jacob. Then you get another genealogy about Genesis 32 thereabout. And the next main person is Jacob. Now, you find that while we don't get a genealogy as it relates to transitioning from Jacob to Joseph, you find, however, that Joseph becomes the main character in the last, let's say, 10 chapters of the book of Genesis. And so tonight we will pick up at Genesis 41. And of course, we we've already read Genesis 41. We have been through it, but I'm going to recap tonight, and then we pick up. So in Genesis 41, we encounter, we see where Pharaoh had a dream, and Genesis 41 starts with a phrase I like to use: after 2 full years. Did the 2 full years meant Joseph spent 2 full years in prison, or was it 2 full years from the time the cupbearer and the baker were released from prison, and the cupbearer was restored to his position, and the other was executed? I want to believe that is the case. Now, we're familiar with the story where Pharaoh had a dream, and in the dream, he had the dream that occurred twice. First, there were 7 well-fed cows coming out of the river Nile. They grazed. Then there were 7 sickly and thin cows also coming out of the Nile. They fed beside, fat cows. But after a while, they devoured the well fed cows. Pharaoh woke up, he fell back asleep, and had a second dream. And the second dream was similar to the first, only this time it had to do with grains that were of good stock and grains that were scorched thin. And the thin ones swallowed up the well the well kept ones. The thing about it is neither the skinny cows nor the thin grains changed. Pharaoh woke up the morning and he was troubled, and so he got all his wise men, all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. And as I shared last week, and as I shared on the other my other program, it is something that you'll notice with the pagan kings during that time in history. They were interested. Well, they wanted. It was a their time unlike ours, and although it still is, they were about the gods. Everything for them was about what the gods are saying. And so, in having these men around, they were like oracles for the gods, the mouthpieces, and they would do their omens and their sorcery and their necromancy to um, to get information from the gods. Of course, you know that isn't right. However, what what they didn't realize, or what Pharaoh didn't realize, was they were wrong. And I suppose he knew as well. However, God would block it. But first thing, the dream is from God. The dream is from God. It's not from any other source. And that was the main reason why they could not interpret the dream. That was the main reason. The cupbearer then remembered what his time in prison, and so he referred or recommended Joseph to Pharaoh. Pharaoh sent for Joseph. He was to quickly taken from the prison, shaved, changed his clothes, and he went before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh told him that he had a dream and he needed it to be interpreted. Because to Pharaoh, and you have to understand the culture, this meant that what this meant that what Pharaoh dreamed, Pharaoh wanted to know what the gods were saying, and this is why he was so frantic. But it was from the true God. None of his wise men couldn't, and so here is Joseph. And Pharaoh shared the dream with him. At the end, he said, I told this dream to my magicians, but no one could explain it to me. Joseph, 2 weeks ago I said this. For those of you who are into the prophetic, for those of you who are seers, please take note. There's a couple of symbolism in this interpretation. First thing Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. And this was the reason why they couldn't do it, the magicians could interpret it. In looking at the well kept cows and the well kept grains, he said to Pharaoh, the dreams have the same meaning. And in looking at the slim cows and the thin ears of corn, he also said the dream had the same meaning. And then he repeated himself. He said, just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown what he is about to do. And so he shared with him that there'll be 7 years of plenty throughout the land, and then there'll be 7 years of famine. The famine will be such that the abundance will be forgotten and it will devastate the land. Another thing about the dream is that, and again, prophets and seers need to understand, and those who have dreams and vision, symbolism. He said to Pharaoh in verse 32 that the dream given to Pharaoh was given in two versions, and the matter has been decreed by God, and he will carry it out shortly. So the thing about it is, a matter is settled at the witness of, out of the mouth of two or three witnesses. And so, in getting it twice, it was confirmation that this thing will happen. And so it was that we know the story that it happened. Remember now, like I said, Pharaoh only needed somebody to interpret the dream because his intention was to hear what the gods were saying. And I shared in the last podcast that something that I've learned reading John Maxwell's books. And he shared how when you are sent out to do a project, don't return with one answer, but return with more than one. Because generally those that send you out already knows the answer. But you coming with more than one will cause them to think. But be certain that the next time there is a project, you will be the one offered the position. He was only asked about the dream, but he gave further advice. He said to Pharaoh, look for a discerning and wise man. Set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take action and appoint commissioners over the land. So he said, first, find somebody to set over the land. And then, in telling Pharaoh to take action and appoint commissioners, it meant that there needs to be added workers over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of famine. A fifth of the harvest meant 20%. So basically saying you're gonna have to live off 80% and save 20%. So imagine saving 20% in 7 years. Let's say you do that for every month. That's a whole lot. Then he goes on, he said, under the authority of Pharaoh, let him collect all the excess food from these good years. So not just 20%, but the excess. Remember, it's going to be a time of abundance. So the overflow needs also be stored up and put them in food cities or storage cities. And this food will be reserved for the land during the 7 years of famine to come upon the earth. Then the country will not perish. So not only did he interpret it, but with wisdom, he advised Pharaoh what to do. Now, this is critical. Here it was that a man of God, as according to Pharaoh, that the spirit of the gods are in him, he was standing before Pharaoh. He didn't portray himself as religious, although at that time it wouldn't be a problem because unlike our time where our lives are compartmentalized. So this is my education life, this is my financial life, this is my social life, this is my family life, etc. In that culture, everything was in one. So now, um, he stood before Pharaoh and he was bold to advise Pharaoh. because of what was in him. What am I saying to those of us tonight that are listening? I'm saying this. You have been placed in positions of influence. You may not be the top man, you may not be the person at the helm, and you may be, but you are in a position of influence and leadership. Influence those that are around you. Give advice. They're actually looking to you for advice. Sometimes in your wisdom, just use, sometimes it's not just you have to wait until they ask, but with the wisdom that the Lord gives you, you make recommendation or you make suggestions, you will be listened to. People knows that when you open your mouth to speak, that there's something about you that is different. A little example, I remember I am in the field of sales and marketing, and I remember I was in the trade one day, and I remember a young man saying, he was looking at the girls, and boy, he has to be rich to have one of these girls. And I said, not really. Because what if something happens that you lose all of that? It means that the woman is going to go, or possibly go. And so I advised him, I said, no, let it not be because, let, let it not be because of money that a woman love you. Let her love you for who you are. You can build together. When I was through, he said to me, uncle, that's a good advice. I never saw life like that. Joseph advised Pharaoh what he ought to do. Pharaoh was impressed, and Pharaoh said to his men, the scripture says the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his officials. It pleased him and all his officials. And Pharaoh then in turn said, can we find a man or anyone like this in whom the Spirit of God abides? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, because now Pharaoh is realizing that it's not just the dream, but God or the gods have made all of this known to you. There's no one wise and discerning as you. And then he said, you shall be in charge of my house, and all my people are to obey your commands. Only with regard to the throne, I'll be greater than you. House in the Hebrew is bait, covering the place of rule, the place of authority, the place where the people are fed. So Pharaoh was saying to Joseph, all of this, my house, my administration, my country, you are in charge. Only me, Pharaoh, is greater than you. So Pharaoh approves of it, and he appoints Joseph as governor. Some scholars say it's prime minister, but that's fine. So he appoints him governor next to himself over the whole land of Egypt. And he then gave him ensigns of dignity, and stately presents were conferred on him. He was given a new name, Zaphnath Paneah, and he was given a wife. Joseph was 30 years old when he was given this position, and soon he progressed over the land to inspect the stores, well, to build them because there were none, and to lay up provision. And in the process, during the times of abundance, he had two children, Manasseh and Ephraim, before the bad years came. Joseph's influence on Egypt was huge. His influence on that nation was huge. Researchers have said that in their research they have found buildings of Semitic origin, which was different from those of the Egyptians. So there was famine. So he built the storehouses for Egypt. So now that he was in charge, so he was in charge, he entered the service of Pharaoh at 30. And so during the 7 years, the land brought forth abundantly. But during those 7 years, Joseph collected all the excess food in the land of Egypt and stored it in cities. And as he said, in every city he laid up food from the fields around it. So here's another principle. You know, in our time, we're hearing a lot of things about a famine is coming. And how many of us are making preparation for it. An Egyptologist by the name of James Hoffmeyer said there are details in the Joseph stories. He said there are a number of little details in the Joseph story or in the narrative that specialized in ancient Near Eastern studies that he notices as it relates to Joseph. One of the things he said, and I've alluded to it earlier, is that most people in the ancient world believed that dreams were a way in which the deity would communicate with a human directly. That's one way. A deity would communicate with a human directly through dreams. And some of these dreams were very serious. Now, one of the things that the Egyptians did was that they had what was called, well, it is in the British Museum, it is called the Chester Beatty Papyrus. And this papyrus was a dream interpretation manual. And this was held by a priest in the temple. So you get to understand the importance of a dream and why Pharaoh was so frantic. And if you go to Daniel chapter 2, you'll find how why Nebuchadnezzar was so frantic, because for them, the deity wanted to speak to them directly and they needed to understand, especially the fact that they are kings. Another thing that Hoffman says about Joseph, and you can now see why God put him there, was that it seems as if Joseph is presented as a wise man who can interpret dreams without the benefit of the dream interpretation manual. So this would fit nicely in the Egyptian setting. So God was setting Joseph apart. When you can do something out of the box, God's favor is upon your life. So God helped Joseph to interpret the dream, Pharaoh's dream, right? And so it was. And he was now in charge of preparing the country for this famine. Now, there are a couple of things that I noticed in the Genesis passage, that 41 passage that caught my attention. It says, a wind. I want to go back to what it says. Right, in Genesis 41:7, it says, it spoke of a scorching east wind. This was when Joseph was telling him, moreover, the seventh thin, well, Pharaoh was telling, no, Joseph was telling him what it meant. And so in verse 27, it said, moreover, the seven thin, ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and so are the seven worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. Now, there are certain geographical phenomena that scholars have used to explain why there was a famine. For example, they're saying that there was a low Nile, it had low inundations, or when fields were flooded, it can cause famine because when the fields are flooded, they're unable to plant grains, and so it prevents people from getting food. Now, why did I make mention of the east wind? Because certain weather patterns can cause there to continue to be rain. So an east wind, Egypt was at northern Africa, northeast Africa. East wind would be coming from the Middle East section, going to Egypt, and it could bring weather patterns into that area. Nobody knows how long it could cause that. So one view is that when the fields are flooded, it can cause famine because it would stop people from planting crops if the water doesn't flow over the land for a couple months of the year. Sorry. So if there's a flooding, it will prevent you from planting. And if there's a dry season, one still cannot plant. But one of the things scholars have found about this was that Joseph, let me let me just share quickly. One view is that there's something happened further upstream in the river, and that the river Nile, its source is really in the central highlands of Africa, or the Ethiopian highlands. So normally in spring, it rains a lot in that area, and that water flows down the river and floods the Nile. So that what happened if this rainfall was 4 or 5 times the normal amount, the river would flood exactly to 4 or 5 times the normal level. It would take so long to disappear. I think that's what happened. And with that flowing, it would take 5 months. And probably by the time it run off, you may have another rainy season. Remember what I spoke about, the east wind. So the river would flood because it will take 4 to 5 months to run off. So this would take so long to disappear. And in one view, that is what happened. So another view is, so what are you thinking? So there was no rain where Joseph's family was up in Canaan, but there was rain somewhere else. A scholar by the name of Roll says that what happened is that the tropical zone around the equator has shifted northwards, causing rain to fall more heavily in the Ethiopian highlands. And what that does, it pushes the dry Saharan climate into Canaan, the area where Jacob and his family lived. So you had one area where there was drought and another area where there was inundation. But guess what? This inundation had to do with the time of the famine. So in other words, if we go by this, you know what is happening? God was telling Pharaoh about what was coming as it relates to some weather pattern. Like we had a few years ago, we had El Nino, and of recent times is El Nino or La Nina. Sorry, my Spanish isn't so great. No habla español, right? And so you had that situation where there was a dry area in Canaan while there was rain. So no crops growing in Canaan, while none could be planted, even though they had rain because it was inundated by long months. There were rainy months, first of all. So first you had the rainy months, and it may not even that it rained in Egypt, but because of where the Nile started, all the way in the highlands of Ethiopia, which is south of Egypt, and it flows, then you had that problem. And it flows. So then you have that problem. So Joseph was basically preparing them for this situation. The thing about it is, this phenomena may have happened at some other time or during that 7 year period because archaeologists they have found that Joseph, to solve this problem, built what was called a canal. He built a canal, and the canal name was the waterway of Joseph, or Bahar or Bar Yosef in Arabic. It was really so it's canal or it was a waterway. It was which how we built it was to channel the water from going into the main areas where people resided, and it took the water from those main cities and channeled it somewhere else. He actually built a lake and a canal. So that was what was happened. And it still has that name today. So he took off a lot of the water. And the canal name was Fayum. So Joseph not only advised Pharaoh, but he, in taking the position, he built storage cities, and not just storage cities, but not just storage cities, but he built a canal to to help. So he built a canal. Right. Now, as we get to Genesis 42, so you can see the impact of Joseph even during this period. So he was working to solve the problem. And so that is just some conjectures that of what he did, and it's plausible, right? It is plausible to what he did. So he built the cities. He built the stored cities. He um he went as far as, and there are many other projects that he had taken on while during his reign in Egypt. Now, so remember I said earlier, so there was a period where, if I use that conjecture of the east wind, with the tropical equator, things moving forth, and you had the rains in northern Africa, well, in the highlands of Ethiopia or islands of Africa, and so there was dry weather in Canaan. Now, Genesis 42 tells us that Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt. Remember, he was a trader, so he learned. News traveled, people were going to Egypt for food because now you're in the time of the famine. And so he said to his son, "Why are you staring at one another? Look, I have heard there is grain in Egypt." Remember who he was. He was a patriarch, so he would have met with the other tribal leaders and they would talk business and ideas and the latest stuff. And so he heard. And so he spoke to his sons, asking them why they're staring at one another. He heard that there was grain in Egypt, and so he advised them to go down, though they were big men. And this is something that is we need to understand. Not that they didn't take initiative, but there was this respect for headship, for the patriarch, that is advice is generally taken as the final say. Not that they don't have an opinion on stuff. They do what the patriarch or the authority says is what they go by. So he advised them that they should go down to Egypt and to buy some of the grain, that they will live and not die. The grain really is not to plant, but it was to eat. So 10 of his sons, or 10 of Joseph's brothers, went down to Egypt. Of course, he didn't send Benjamin because he was afraid what that harm might befall him, similar to what happened with Joseph. Do you think that he suspected that maybe those 10 other 10 did something? I've never looked at this way before, but in reading it, it's quite a possibility. And so the other 10 sons, they went off to buy grain in Egypt. Now Joseph was selling grain to all the people that came. His brothers arrived, they bowed before him, their faces to the ground, and he immediately recognized them, but he treated them like strangers, and he also spoke harshly with them. The first thing he said, "Where are you from?" I'm sure in a very commanding tone. They told him they were from the land of Canaan and that they're here to buy food. He recognized them, but they did not recognize him. Possibly they forgot him, maybe not, they didn't. But they wouldn't have recognized that he would have been in this position. At this point in time, he remembered the dream he had, because here they bowed to him. It was them who bowed to him. He remembered his dreams about them. And so he said, "You are spies. You have come to see if our land is vulnerable," because there were 10. And you get the idea what Moses did. And that was it. In wars, they send emissaries out to negotiate, but it was also to spy the land. And so it was. But of course, he knew who they were. So they said, "That's so, my lord. We have come to buy food. We are the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. Probably saying we're honest, hardworking men. But he continued to say that they came to see if the land was vulnerable. And so they spoke up. In order to defend themselves, they said, your servants are 12 brothers. Hmm. They are acknowledging Joseph, though didn't know it was him. We are the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. He replied again. He said, just as I said, you are spies. So he said to them, this is how you'll be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother come here. So he said, send one of your number to get your brother, and the rest of you will be confined, so that the truth of your words may be tested. If they are untrue, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. So now he's putting them to the test. So he imprisoned them for 3 days. On the third day, he said, I fear God, so do this and you will live. If you are honest, I guess being who he is, he cannot be hard. And so he said, if you are honest, he's saying, okay, guess what? Leave one of your brother in custody while the rest of you go back. Take grain to relieve the hunger of your household. So he considered their plight. Even in the midst of being um, rough with them, he considered their plight and he decides to keep one in custody while he sent them home to relieve the hunger of their household. But then he said, you have to bring the youngest so that your words may be verified and you may not die. So they agreed. Afterwards, they started mumbling, not realizing that Joseph was hearing. They started fussing. And that is the thing when one does something wrong. There comes a point where it eats at you. They said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. They said, and look, that has been so long. I think Joseph was 17 when this was done to him. So that's like 13 years. We saw his anguish when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. This is why this distress has come upon us. Reuben then responded, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you would not listen. Now we must account for his blood. I want to say something before I go further. Yes, whatsoever a man sows, that's what he reaps. But how many of us realize that sometimes we are also forgiven, and in the forgiveness, we are forgiven, but we don't forgive ourselves. We don't. For a lot of us, it's easier to forgive somebody else because it is what we have heard at church, you must forgive, you must forgive. But we never forgive ourselves of our mistakes. Because here it was, these brothers, hearts are eating them away because of what they did to Joseph. And yes, it has to be dealt with. There are things that has to be dealt with in order to come to a place of peace and rest. But now they're seeing the errors of their way. They didn't realize, though, that Joseph understood them since there was an interpreter between them. So he turned away from them and wept. And when he turned back, he spoke to them and he kept Simeon and he bound him before their eyes. Joseph then gave orders that their bags were to be filled with grain and that each man's money was to be returned to his sack. So in other words, I don't think Jacob gave them money. It was their own money, because they had their own flocks. And so, if you do understand anything about that culture, they would have their own thing. And so, they were given provision. Their silver, as in their money, was given to them. And so the orders were carried. It's just that they didn't know. And they loaded the grain. So they left out, and while they lodged at a place for the night, because remember, they didn't go by car, they went by possibly caravans or horses. And so it took days to reach back home. But when one of them opened the sack to feed his animal, he saw the money at the mouth of the sack. And so he said, "My silver has returned to me," he said to his brothers. "It is here in my sack." Now, all of them felt it. They trembled. And they said, "What does this mean? What is this that God has done to us?" Because when they reached home, they described to their father all that happened. They said, "The man who is the Lord of the land spoke harshly to us and accused us of being spies." They told him, they related to their father that they said to him, "Look, we're honest men, we're not spies, we're 12 brothers, we have one father. One of our brother is no more, and the youngest is with our father." And they continued to share with their father what the man over the land, the Lord of the land, said. And they shared that look, because obviously Jacob may have asked, "Where's Simeon?" And he said, "Listen, the man, to prove that we're honest, he told us to leave one of our brothers, take food to relieve our soul, and go. But we must bring our youngest brother back, and that is the only way he will know that we are not spies, but honest men." And then he said, "Then I'll give your brother back to you, and you can trade in the land." And so as they were emptying their sack, each man found out that their bag of silver or money was there. Jacob saw the bags and he was dismayed. They weren't realizing they were being fed by the brother they sent ahead of them. Now, strangely enough, Jacob said to these guys, "You have deprived me of my sons. Joseph is gone. Simeon is no more. Now you want to take Benjamin? Everything is going against me." So he's accusing them of his sons that are gone in his view. Reuben went to his father and he said, "Look, and this is a wrong proposition. You may kill my two sons if I fail to bring him back to you, but put him in my care and I'll return him." But Jacob replied, "My son will not go down there with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If any harm comes to him on your journey, you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow." It's interesting that if we should go forward into verse 43, we will see not that Jacob, because of the situation, gave in, but it was because of who at that time made the proposal. Reuben, at this point in time, in his father's eyes, has lost all credibility with him, though he was the firstborn. What he did, and that's key, in sleeping with his father's concubine, In that culture, when somebody of a lower rank takes the concubine of the head, the king, the authority, they are really saying that I am the one in charge. So in other words, they are challenging the one who is the leader. It is a challenge they are proposing to him, and they are seeking to usurp the position of leadership. Jacob recognized that when Reuben did it, because that is saying, I am in charge now. So Jacob recognized that. So he would never trust him again. He would never trust him again. And though I don't want to go ahead of myself, um, I want to look to support what I'm saying. Genesis 49, you read where before Jacob died, he gathered his sons and he told them what would happen to them in days to come. And I look only at what he said to Reuben. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, excelling in honor and excelling in power, uncontrolled as water. You will no longer excel because you went up on your father's bed onto my couch and defiled it. I want to skip over to First Samuel, and um, I want to share what I want to share another thing. This is not a father, but person in position. So remember, David had a number of sons. He had a son by the name of Adonijah. Now, Adonijah wanted to become the king, but of course, David appointed Solomon. After Solomon had sat on the throne of his father and his kingdom was firmly established, Adonijah's brother went to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and she asked, do you come in peace? And he said to her, yes, in peace. He said to her, I have something to tell you. So he said to her, you know that the kingship was mine. All Israel expected that I should reign, but the kingship has turned to my brother, for it has come from the Lord. So now I have just one request of you. Do not deny me. She said, state your request. Donadiah replied, please speak to King Solomon, since he will not turn you down. Let him give me Abishag, the Shunammite, as my wife. Bathsheba replied, very well, I'll speak to the king. So she went in and she spoke to her son. She even said, I have one small request. Do not deny me. And Solomon replied, make your request, my mother. I will not deny you. So she said, let Abishag the Shunammite be given to your brother Adonijah as his wife. Solomon asked his mother, why do you request Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Since he is my older brother, you might as well request a kingdom for him. Now, why did Solomon respond like that? Because in that culture, and you'll see in Second Samuel, Absalom did the same thing. He slept with David's concubine in the presence of the public. It was a cultural act. It was an act of that culture of someone seeking to usurp. It's a rebellion to overthrow leadership. So in sleeping with the concubine, not the wife. And so this is exactly what Reuben did. Jacob didn't forget it. And so in Genesis 42, then, where he says to his father that, look, that, um, and it's a crazy proposal, the same way, where he said, look, said to his father, you may kill my two sons. He also went to the extreme. You may kill my two sons if I fail to bring him back to you. Put him in my care and I'll return him. And Jacob says, no, my son will not go down there with you. My brother is dead and he alone is left. This has to do with more than fear, but the person who makes the proposal. He has lost his father's trust. Another great story it's the story of Ham and Noah. Ham did one of two things. He either, it says, he saw his father's nakedness. Really, Ham, if you read Leviticus 21, in seeing your father's nakedness is really seeing the, your mother, having sex with your mother or your stepmother. And that is what Ham did. Because when you realize Jacob didn't say, cursed be Ham, he said, cursed be Canaan, because Canaan was as a result of what his father did. It was his attempt to usurp his father's authority. Why? Check a couple of things about Ham. Nimrod was from the tribe of Ham. Not saying that everyone from Ham is evil, but there is a branch of Ham that is thus. All right, so that ends our discussion tonight in Genesis 41 and 42. We'll pick up next week in Genesis 43 and 44. And of course, you know where we stopped tonight, and it's where um, the brothers were back in Canaan, and their money was returned to them without them knowing it. Um, Simeon, their brother, Jacob's second son, was locked away was still in custody in Egypt. And the request from the man over the land, Joseph, they not knowing it was Joseph, is that they take their youngest brother on their next trip to convince him that they're honest men and not spies. So we'll pick up next week in Genesis 43 and 44. Thanks for watching. This has been the Open Book. The Open Book is your weekly Bible study podcast. We're studying the book of Genesis, and we're at Genesis 41 and 42. We're looking at the final main character in this book, the book of Genesis, or the book of beginnings. Thanks for watching. You can like, comment, and share this podcast. It is available on YouTube at Rick Winter Ministry. Also, it's also broadcast live simultaneously. It's a triple broadcast on Facebook at Kevin Winter, Rick Winter Ministry on YouTube, and Alric.Winter on Twitter. Thanks for joining, and I will see you next week at 8:30, where we continue with the program, The Open Book. Join me this Sunday for my other program, Deciphering the End Times, as we continue our study in the book of Daniel. God bless you. Have yourselves a good night.